The envelope was waiting on the kitchen counter when Claire Bennett got home from work. No return address. No stamp. Just her name, written in familiar blue ink. Claire frowned, a knot forming in her stomach. She lived alone in her late grandmother's house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, quiet. Unassuming town where mailboxes still mattered and neighbors still waved from their front porches. It was a town that held its breath and its secrets. She hadn't told many people she'd moved back. Only a handful of distant relatives and her boss knew her new address. So who had left this on her counter? She picked up the envelope. The paper felt old, not fragile, but aged, like something preserved for years. Inside was a single folded letter. The handwriting was neat, elegant, and it matched the scrawl on the outside. Claire, it began. If you're reading this, then you finally came back. You were always meant to. There's something in this house you were never told about. Something important. Start in the attic, M. Claire stared at the signature. M, her grandmother's name, had been Margaret. But everyone, absolutely everyone, had called her Maggie. No one called her M. Her grandmother had passed away 6 months ago, leaving behind a void in this quiet old house. Claire swallowed hard. This had to be a joke. A very cruel, very elaborate joke. She walked through the house slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silence, checking every door, every window. All were locked tight. No sign of forced entry. The house was exactly as she'd left it that morning. The attic? She hadn't even been up there since moving in 3 weeks ago. The thought of it, filled with dust and forgotten memories, made her uneasy. But the letter was a puzzle she couldn't ignore. The pool downstairs creaked in protest as she climbed, each groan a warning. Dust hung heavy in the air, dancing in the single beam of light from the bare bulb hanging from the rafters. Old boxers lined the walls, cardboard tombs filled with a lifetime of possessions. She stood still, listening, her ears straining against the profound silence of the house. Nothing. Then she saw it. Tucked away in a back corner, almost hidden behind a stack of old magazines, was a small wooden chest. It looked ancient, far older than anything else in the attic. It wasn't decorative. It was functional, built to last, and meant to be hidden. Claire knelt, her knees popping, and brushed a thick layer of dust off the lid. There was no lock. Her breath caught in her throat. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was another envelope. Same paper, same blue ink. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Claire, the second letter read, "If you found this, you're braver than I expected. Or maybe just more curious. Either way, good. What I'm about to tell you will change how you see this town, this family, everything. In 1978, something happened in Cedar Falls. Something that was covered up, and your grandmother was part of it. Go to the old train depot tomorrow at exactly 3:15 p.m. Bring this letter. You'll understand. M. 1978. Claire did the math. Her grandmother would have been 22 years old. A young woman, full of life. What could she possibly have been involved in that needed to be covered up? The old train depot had been closed for decades, a skeleton of a building on the edge of town, abandoned. Teenagers sometimes dared each other to go inside, spinning ghost stories about its past. It was a place of rust and shadows. Claire folded the letter carefully and went back downstairs, the wooden chest left open in the silent attic. She barely slept that night. And who else knew? The next day passed in a blur. At 3:12 p.m., she found herself standing outside the depot. Claire folded the letter carefully and went back downstairs, the wooden chest left open in the silent attic. She barely slept that night, her mind racing with questions, each one darker than the last. Who was M? What secret had her grandmother taken to her grave? They missed nothing. "You brought the letter?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Claire clutched her purse tighter. Yes. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening just a little. "I was wondering if you'd come back." "Do I know you?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," he said. "But I knew your grandmother. I knew Maggie." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken history. "She told me if anything ever happened to her," he continued, his voice low, "I was to wait for you, in case you returned." Claire's pulse quickened. Wait for me for what? The man stepped closer, his scent a faint mix of pipe tobacco and motor oil. For the truth? Before she could respond, the rumble of an engine broke the stillness. A dusty pickup truck turned the corner and slowed to a crawl near the depot. The older man's expression shifted instantly, his face hardening into a mask of urgency. "They're watching," he whispered, his eyes darting towards the truck. "Who?" Claire breathed, her fear mounting. He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed something cold and metallic into her hand, a small, ornate brass key. "You don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "This opens a post office box. Number 418. The information is there. Your grandmother wanted you to have it." The truck stopped directly across the street. Two men sat inside, their faces obscured by shadows, but their attention was fixed on the depot. On them. Claire looked back at the older man, her mind reeling. But he was already walking away, quickly, without a backward glance, disappearing around the far side of the building. And the truck doors were opening. Her heart leaped into her throat. She gripped the key in her palm, its edges digging into her skin. "Run!" The single word screamed through her mind. She turned and ran, not towards her car, but away from the street, into the overgrown field behind the depot. She didn't know who the men in the truck were, or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a joke. Her grandmother's secret was real, it was dangerous, and now it was hers. The key in her hand felt impossibly heavy, a burden and a promise, the first step on a path from which there was no turning back. The quiet life she had sought in Cedar Falls was over. Something far more complicated had just begun. The truck doors creaked open, and my heart hammered against my ribs. Two men stepped out, their movements deliberate, controlled. They didn't look angry, which was somehow more terrifying. The taller one spoke first, his voice calm, almost placid. "That building isn't safe. You shouldn't be there." I just stared, my mind racing. The other man's eyes, cold and assessing, narrowed slightly. "You're Margaret Bennett's granddaughter, right?" The question landed like a punch to the gut. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Yes," I managed to say, the word barely a whisper. There was a short, heavy pause. The first man spoke again, his voice dropping even lower. "Some things are better left in the past." And just like that, I understood. This wasn't about a crumbling building or my safety. This was about silence. This was a warning. I didn't say another word. I turned, walked back to my car, my back ramrod straight. They didn't move to stop me, but I could feel their gaze burning into my back as I pulled away, tires crunching on the gravel. Back at my grandmother's house, I locked the doors. The sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the sudden quiet of the kitchen. My hand was still clenched around the old brass key. Number 12. The number sparked a flicker of memory, a forgotten image from childhood. The old, numbered lockers in the basement. A place I hadn't been in years. My feet carried me down the creaking wooden stairs, into the cool, musty air that smelled of damp concrete and forgotten things. And there they were, a row of rusty metal lockers against the far wall. I walked along the line, my fingers tracing the faded, stenciled numbers, 10, 11, 12. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely fit the key into the lock. I held my breath, turned it. With a low, metallic groan that sounded like a sigh of relief, the locker door swung open. Inside, sitting alone on the dusty metal shelf, was a small tin box. Nothing else. I carried it upstairs like a fragile artifact and set it carefully on the kitchen table. My fingers fumbled with the clasp. What could be so important that it needed to be locked away for decades? The lid popped open. Inside there were only two things, a photograph and a cassette tape. I reached for the photo first. It was old, the colors slightly faded, but the faces were clear. 3 young people, standing outside the old train depot, the same place I had just been. One of them was my grandmother, Margaret. She was so young, her smile radiant, full of life. And standing beside her, his arm casually draped over her shoulder, was a 19-year-old boy, Daniel Harper, the missing teen from 1978. My throat went tight. They weren't strangers. The old newspaper articles had never mentioned a connection. But this photo, they knew each other. Maybe they were close. My mind spun with questions. I carefully placed the photo down and picked up the cassette. My grandmother had kept her old player, a clunky silver machine tucked away on a bookshelf. I found it, blew the dust off, and inserted the tape. I pressed play. The room filled with a hiss of static. And then, a voice. Her voice. My grandmother's voice. But it wasn't the voice I knew, the one that had read me bedtime stories. This voice was soft, young, and trembling with a fear that reached across 40 years. "If you're hearing this," she began, her words barely a whisper. Then I didn't have the courage to tell the truth myself. I stopped breathing. The world seemed to stop turning. "It was an accident," she continued, her voice breaking. Daniel didn't mean to fall. But the wrong people saw it happen, and they decided it couldn't become a scandal. A shaky breath rattled through the speakers. They said the town would suffer, that businesses would close, families would be ruined, So they made us stay quiet. Tears started to burn my eyes, blurring the kitchen around me. They buried the evidence near the depot, she confessed. Her voice choked with the grief she had carried alone for so long. They told his parents he ran away. And we were all just kids. We were too scared to fight back. The tape clicked off. The sudden, profound silence was deafening. Daniel Harper hadn't run away. He hadn't just disappeared. He had died here, in this small, quiet town. And the entire town, it seemed, had conspired to hide it. As I stood there, reeling, my phone buzzed on the table, a sharp, intrusive sound. Unknown number. My hand hesitated over the screen before I slowly answered. Hello? A familiar voice, deep and gravelly, came through the line. The older man from the depot. You found it. It wasn't a question. Yes, I whispered, my own voice hoarse. There was a pause on the other end, filled with something I couldn't quite decipher. Respect, regret. They'll try to stop you now, he said, his tone flat, matter-of-fact. Because once truth comes out, it doesn't go back underground. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, then my gaze fell back to the photograph on the table. My grandmother, smiling, unaware of the lifetime of silence that lay ahead of her. She had lived with this secret, this heavy, crushing weight, for over 40 years. And now, the secret belonged to me. The question was, what was I going to do with it? This was bigger than just a family secret. This was the town's secret. And I had a feeling that uncovering it would mean tearing this seemingly peaceful community apart at the seams. But how could I let it lie? How could I look at Daniel Harper's young, hopeful face in that photograph and do nothing? The silence had lasted long enough. The secret was her grandmother's, but the burden was now hers. Claire sat frozen, the old photograph trembling in her hand. Her grandmother's smile, once a beacon of warmth, now seemed heavy, massing a lifetime of secrets. Tears streamed down her face, not just for her grandmother, but for a truth buried for decades. She wiped them away, a new resolve hardening in her heart. If her grandmother couldn't fix this, if fear had held her captive for all those years, then she would. She would be the one to break the silence. The next morning, Claire walked into the small, unassuming office of the Cedar Falls local newspaper. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and fresh ink. She approached the front desk, her voice steady as she asked to speak with the editor. He emerged from a back room, a man with tired eyes and a skeptical frown. He listened to her initial words with a polite, yet dismissive air. That all changed the moment she placed the faded photograph on his worn wooden desk. His eyes widened. Then, she pressed play on the old cassette recorder. The tinny, recorded voice filled the quiet office. Weaving a story of a long-forgotten night in 1978, the room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the worry of the tape. When it clicked off, the editor leaned back, the skepticism gone, replaced by a look of sheer gravity. "This is serious," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Claire met his gaze, her own unwavering. "Yes," she said. "It is." By evening, the story had exploded online. The headline was stark. New evidence emerges in 1978 missing person case. Cedar Falls, A town that had long since moved on was suddenly thrown back 40 years. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Some residents were shocked, their long-held beliefs shattered. Others were angry, feeling betrayed. A stubborn few refused to believe it, dismissing it as a desperate grab for attention. But no one, absolutely no one, could ignore it. The town was buzzing with whispers, arguments, and a heavy sense of unease. That night, a sharp knock echoed through Claire's quiet house. She opened the door to a familiar, yet chilling sight. The same two men from the train depot stood on her porch, their faces grim, stripped of their earlier forced smiles. "You don't understand what you've started," the first one said, his voice low and menacing. But Claire didn't flinch. The fear that had once gripped her was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. "What I started," she replied, her voice calm and clear. "This started in 1978. The second man stepped forward, his tone dropping to an almost pleading whisper. "You're going to tear this town apart." Claire slowly shook her head, the porchlight catching the determined set of her jaw. "No. The truth doesn't tear towns apart. Lies do." There was nothing more to say. They didn't argue, they didn't threaten. They just turned and walked away into the darkness. And this time, Claire knew they wouldn't be coming back. Within days, the sleepy town of Cedar Falls was swarming with state investigators. The cold case of Daniel Harper, the boy who vanished without a trace, was officially reopened. Old files, gathering dust for decades, were pulled from archives and scrutinized under fresh eyes. The real action, however, was at the abandoned train depot. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was brought in, its electronic hum a stark contrast to the rural quiet. Claire stood behind the yellow police tape, watching as investigators meticulously scanned the ground beneath the old station. Hours bled into one another under the hot Iowa sun. The crowd that had gathered watched in hushed anticipation. Then, a shout cut through the air. An investigator called out, pointing to a specific spot near the foundation. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Something had been found. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone held their breath as the excavation team worked with painstaking care. Soon, their search yielded a grim discovery. Human remains, buried deep beneath the old platform. The town's long-held narrative of a runaway boy had just been violently dismantled. Weeks later, dental records delivered the final, heartbreaking confirmation. It was Daniel Harper. He had never run away. He had never started a new life somewhere else. He had been there, in the heart of his hometown, all along. A memorial service was held the following week. The entire town seemed to be there, their faces a mixture of grief, guilt, and a strange sense of relief. After the service, a woman with kind, weary eyes approached Claire. It was Daniel's younger sister, only 10 years old when her world was torn apart by his disappearance. She took Claire's hand, her voice a fragile whisper. "You gave us answers," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "You gave him back to us." Claire felt a lump form in her throat. "I'm so sorry it took so long." The woman managed a small, sad smile and nodded. "At least now, we know." That evening, Claire sat in the familiar quiet of her grandmother's kitchen. But the house felt different. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from its very foundations. The air felt lighter, clearer. It wasn't haunted anymore, just peaceful. She retrieved the small wooden chest from the attic, the one that had started it all, and placed her grandmother's final letter inside, alongside the others. Her grandmother hadn't been a monster. She had been a young woman trapped by fear, a fear so powerful it had kept a terrible truth buried for 40 long years. Claire looked around the cozy home, finally understanding. Secrets might protect a reputation, they might shield a business, they might preserve a comfortable lie, but they never, ever protect your peace. Only the truth can do that. A few days later, as she was leaving the local market, the older man from the depot approached her one last time. His face was etched with a quiet sadness. "You did what she couldn't," he said, his voice soft. Claire shook her head. "No," she replied. "She led me to it. She left me the map." He offered a faint, knowing smile. Some people plant seeds they never see grow. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the small-town crowd. In that moment, Claire realized the true meaning of her grandmother's final wish. She hadn't been asked to erase the past, or to keep its secrets. She had been asked, in her own way, to face it. And sometimes, simply facing the truth, no matter how painful, is the bravest thing a person can do. Cedar Falls would never be the same. The comfortable illusions were gone. But in their place, a hard-won peace began to settle. And for the first time since 1978, the old Bennett house on the edge of town could finally sleep soundly. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more true stories of secrets, mysteries, and the courage it takes to uncover the truth. See you next time.